Hey APUSH gang, good to see you guys figuratively again. It's Sunday, Easter Sunday in the evening, and I've been working on your lesson for today. My work week is sort of Sunday through Thursday, I guess. I mean, I'm still working on Friday a little bit, but in order to get all my lessons ready for Monday, recorded and everything, I'm usually doing it on Sunday. So coming at you from Easter Sunday. I hope you had a good Sunday with your family and friends. Hopefully not more than 10 friends, according to the state law. So anyway, sometimes I forget we're actually in quarantine. But we had a good Easter weekend, out of the ordinary, but we do church on Saturday, so we actually watched our Saturday night service, Easter service yesterday, and then the kids have tapped into a few things that they enjoy, Easter services online and music and worship and stuff. So it was a good Easter. So I still trying to get caught up, not there yet, but slowly but surely got a lot of grading done for my various classes. So your test is next on my agenda, the test before spring break. So that's where I'm sitting. So, all right. So before I jump into our lesson today, I want to go back and talk a little bit again about the AP exam. As you know, the Zoom meeting was a bit of a disaster. I think that it's probably happening more at my end than it is at your end. I was a little surprised too when everybody popped on with just boxes with their names in them. I didn't even know that that was an option. The first person that I saw was Henry, and he had a still photo of himself. I wouldn't have known that because I couldn't hear anybody talking until I heard Ben say something about nice picture. So if I ever do another Zoom, I am going to require that I see your faces. If you have to see my faces, I am going to require to see yours. But there's a pretty good chance we won't be doing Zoom ever again. I didn't enjoy it. I feel like if you need to talk to me, you can call me. We could even FaceTime. Just not a really big fan. I've watched my own two kids do some Zoom classes. Some with success. The teachers that are very strict. One of Cheney's teachers actually said that they could not be sitting in bed. They had to be up and at 'em and sitting at a desk and engaged. But I am very familiar with all of the nonsense that happens between students texting each other and whatever, which happens anyway during class. So I don't think that I'll be doing a Zoom again. So I want to go over some of these really quick with you that I tried to talk to you about on our Zoom meeting, and it didn't happen. So again, the exam date is May 15th, which will be the very last day of school for us. So we technically have 5 weeks of school, which is just crazy. Going to be at 1 p.m. You'll be taking it from home. It's considered an open note, open book exam. And so we'll have to make sure you have some tools in front of you. Tools meaning notes, dates, timelines, period dates, and that sort of thing in front of you, so that you have an easy touch to look and see kind of where the question's coming from. Let's see here. You will have one modified DBQ. I sent you the rubric, and I also sent you what I'm reading off of here. It will be one DBQ essay question from the periods 3 through 7. So we are going to finish up period 6 this week and test over it at the beginning of next week, and then dive into period 7, which I think is 4 different chapters. So we'll probably have to go through it pretty quickly. In addition to that, just going through period 7, I do want to start doing some review of past important things to kind of remind you kind of where we're sitting. Oh, just realized that Captain America was out of the screen. So he is going to join us again. What else? I gave you the rubric that discusses what they're going to be looking for. It's going to be a little bit different than their standard DBQ, which has 7 documents. This one will only have 5. One of the 5 will be a cartoon or a chart or something along those lines. Everything else will be some sort of primary document, a text-based document. They want you to have at least 2 outside pieces of evidence to support your thesis, in addition to the the documents that they're going to provide for you. And again, because it's open book, open notes, if there's something you can't remember, you have access. You can't use the internet, you can't use your computer in that capacity, but you should have at your fingertips your binder that we've been putting together, so that you can try to target that stuff, or your textbook. Use your textbook as well. So, yeah, that's all I see in here that I was going to cover with you. So I was saying that I plan on giving you a number of sample DBQs, that we're not going to write a bunch of DBQs, but I'm going to let you see what they look like, and I'm going to have you practice writing a thesis over the question, as well as evaluating the documents, so that you kind of get into the practice of doing that, and we'll be working on that for the next 5 weeks. So, okay, with all that all said, I'm going to close those out. And I'm going to jump into our PowerPoint for today. So if you would pull up that PowerPoint, you should have already done your writing prompt. There are 4 questions that I have included in a Google Doc that you were supposed to do at the very beginning of class today. Each of those questions was touched on in the first few pages of this chapter, pages 635 through 653. I read it myself today. Took me a couple hours probably to kind of absorb it. Hopefully you spend the time to do that. In those questions, I really was looking for your efforts to contextualize, to put your answer in context of the time frame, what was happening in the world that question is related to from this chapter. So I wasn't looking for four paragraphs per se, although you could have written a paragraph. And I will be, of course, included that in the instructions for the questions. So I gave you 30 minutes to do that. Hopefully you submitted them and have your PowerPoint pulled up. And I would also, again, if I were you, I'd go ahead and print it. This one has most of the information on it. I went ahead and typed everything out, although there are a few places that I've kind of left open-ended that you'll want to take notes in. So I would strongly suggest that you print it off, or at the very minimum, scribble some notes while you're looking at the PowerPoint in your computer. So, all right, so we're covering chapter 17. The first 15 or 20 pages or so. This chapter is entitled Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad. And the last chapter, chapter 16, dealt a lot with the change in America, the conquering of the Western Plains, away from the final Native American inhabitants, the move westward, as well as the explosion of cities and industrialization during the Second Industrial Era, the Gilded Age, the idea that the very wealthy were getting extremely wealthy, and the very poor were not finding a way out of their poverty, and so there was a lot of disparity between the rich and the poor. You started to hear political commentary about socialism and those sorts of things, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of problems with fighting with the railroad, poor people, farmers, etc., feeling like they were being taken advantage of by some of those larger corporations and the railroads. You see the government begin to intervene to attempt to regulate the railroads, but not so much. And so this chapter jumps into, I guess you could say, the middle of that, and digs a little bit deeper into the politics of the era. And so this particular chapter covers the years from 1890 to 1900, so it's kind of a small window of time. There was a lot of change during that time, a lot of political upheaval, a lot of labor strife, a lot of segregation and laws passed, or not laws, rulings in the Supreme Court that reinforced segregation in the South, and Jim Crow, and a whole bunch of awful stuff. So the introduction to this chapter, hopefully you read that. I always find Eric Foner's introductions to each chapter and each unit very insightful. It kind of gives me the big picture. And so the introductory it's a couple pages of this particular chapter, it basically sets the stage for what we're going to be reading about. And so in that introduction, it says the author would be talking about the populist era and their influence on American politics. That was number one. The second thing, the declining freedom of Black Americans, especially in the South. And then what we haven't talked about yet, imperialism, the Spanish-American War, the Cuban-American War, I'm sorry, the Philippine-American War, and then the changing role of America in the world, going from a kind of an isolationist country to empire building, which was a new thing for America. So those were the three things: populist, or the People's Party, the declining freedom of Black Americans, and then imperialism related to the Spanish-American War, and some others. So today we're going to dive into the populist movement, and we're going to talk a little bit about segregation in the South. Okay, so the People's Party, which is what the Populist Party is oftentimes referred to, is a movement of the people. The first few pages talk about a couple of pretty significant, they call them alliances. The first one was the Farmers Alliance. And the textbook, in quotes, says this was the largest citizen movement of the 19th century. And so it was a swelling movement that was an attempt to try to adjust, modify, prevent, change the way that business and government was treating the people, the little man, the farmers, the workers, the working class. There was a lot of economic uncertainty during this era because of economic travail in our country between 1870 and 1890. There was a pretty significant economic downturn in I think it was 1893. And so the farmers tend to get hit. They had continued to struggle since the Civil War, in large part because the price of food continued to drop, the price of cotton continued to drop. And while farming was becoming industrial or mechanized and modern, those tools and sorts of things were actually very expensive. And so farmers were going in debt to buy those things to produce more so that they could make more money because their food was worth less on the market. And so farmers really, really struggled during this era. The railroads did take advantage of them. Of course, the markets that the food was going to was a significant distance away. And so the railroads control the cost of transportation, the cost of storing, and so farmers ended up getting taken advantage of. And of course, the South continued to suffer under a pretty significant economic downturn, poverty, and of course, Black farmers, tenant farmers in particular, were really, really struggling during this era. So that's the first thing, the Farmers Alliance. And out of that, eventually what's going to happen is this People's Party, or this populist movement, is going to form out of that Farmers Alliance. And so whereas the Farmers Alliance was a citizen movement, largest in the 19th century, the populist movement is going to become the greatest political insurgency. And so the way the book describes it is that farmers began to petition the government to be the ones that controlled their transportation and their storing of food to kind of get around the railroads. And in so doing, there were strings attached. And once farmers aligned themselves with government, they found themselves having to comply with government regulations and all of those strings that were attached to it. And so out of that comes the populist movement. I know that this is kind of boring, by the way. I find it kind of boring as well, but it's important. It's a huge topic. It could very well be the one that you have to write a DBQ about. So we're going to cover it. I'm just going to zip through my bullet points here. The populist movement appealed to farmers, miners, and industrial workers. Let's see here. The greatest appeal was in the cotton and wheat belts of the South. There's always questions on quizzes about that. So specifically, the Populist Party was supported by farmers, and especially out west and in the South. And that's going to bring them into a sort of loose alignment with the Democratic Party that still controls the South. One of their main platforms was the belief that if America would switch to a silver-based currency, a coinage, that farmers would make more for their money would be worth more, and so their products, they would make more money from selling their products. America at that time had gotten rid of the paper currency that Lincoln had introduced during the Civil War, and had taken up the gold standard, which farmers believed reduce the value of their food, and their debt. Their debt was inflated. So long and short of it, farmers wanted to go the silver route because they thought that they could get more coins in their hands for the value of the paper money, and they certainly couldn't afford the gold. So um, honestly, the whole economics of that is difficult for me. I'll just be honest, but I do know that that was what that was on their platform. So they wanted a silver currency. Republicans wanted a gold backed dollar, and then most people were of the mindset that paper money was worthless. And of course, today we are not a gold-based society. The government issues paper money. It's a standard issuance. Everybody gets the same money. So that's where we ended up. The populists used grassroots approach to deliver their messages via pamphlets, established newspapers. They sent around traveling speakers, sort of like the abolitionists did. Many of them had deep religious roots, and so a lot of times their speeches sounded very evangelical, revivalist type of messages, a moral movement. The social gospel movement was also involved in the People's Party. One of the questions you guys were supposed to answer was the question about Donald Trump. Why is he considered a populist president? In spite of the fact that he is filthy rich, President Trump has been able to identify or have the people identify with him as one of them, one of the guys. He's always, I'm in this for you. I'm in it for the people. I'm in it for the little guy. He goes on television and he talks about the postal worker, the people working at Walmart, the food supply chain people, the little guy, whatever. And I got your back. I'm in this for you. I'm going to get you tax cuts. I'm for you. All these news media, these elites, that's fake news. All of these crooked scam politicians. I'm not one of them. I'm one of you. In reality, he's a very wealthy businessman, but he does believe in a hard work ethic. He grew up that way. He raised his kids that way. And so he is definitely a voice of the people. If you go to his rallies and stuff, you see that. Most of the people that go to his rallies are just everyday people. They're not the Hollywood elites. They're just everyday folks. And so he is definitely considered a populist president. And he uses that bully pulpit very similar way to the populist era politicians like William Bryan Jennings, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. If you were a populist politician, your enemies or the people you spoke out against were those captains of industries or those robber barons, the bank tycoons, the railroad executives, the corrupt government officials that were working with them to push you down. And so it was the people versus the institutions in the government, and that was sort of how the populist message was presented. William Jennings Bryan is probably the most important of the populist figureheads that we'll talk about. He was a very evangelical, charismatic, Bible-beating, social justice kind of guy. Today we use that word social justice. Advocating for the little man, for doing what Jesus would do for the least of these, and asking government to take on that role. He was very much that way. When he gave speeches, they said it was almost like he was an evangelist preaching. He eventually is going to run for president. We'll talk about that in a second. Then I have a few other people listed here that the book mentions. I don't think you'd ever have to name them or anything like that, but you might end up getting a primary document that is written by one of them. So Mary Elizabeth Lease, they famously, my APUSH kids last year joked about this. She was, she was first female lawyer in Kansas. She was a very fiery orator, and promoted women's suffrage, and she famously, supposedly said, farmers, you need to raise less corn and more hell. They say she never probably said that, but that line was associated with her. Tom Watson was a leading populist out of Georgia, and his thing was he thought he could try to lure black Southern farmers and white Southern farmers that were both suffering from the poverty related to the troubles of the era. and have them put aside their differences and work together to elect people that would represent the poor. And so it was truly a political maneuver. Didn't have much success in that. The black Southerners tended to try to stay loyal to the Republicans, but there were some crossovers. James Weaver was the very first populist presidential candidate. He ran as the Populist Party candidate. He got over 1 million votes and I think 22 electoral votes, which is a pretty big deal. Probably, I don't know who he stole them from. I don't remember in that particular election. But nonetheless, James Weaver was the first populist presidential candidate. Now, William Jennings Bryan is going to run for president, but he's going to run as a Democrat. All right, the next slide, organized labor versus big business. And so there's a section in there that talks about the all the labor strikes and the growing tensions between those people who were organized in labor parties fighting against the robber barons or the industrial leaders and businesses. And so almost always the courts almost always ruled with the owners, the employers versus the unions. Most people like Carnegie and others moved away from unionization. In fact, I think it was Carnegie who had his henchmen fire everybody that worked for him at one of his steel mills, like thousands of people, and then he replaced them with non-union employees, and the courts upheld that. So the ones that they mentioned, the book does say that big business or employers like Carnegie used federal authority to protect their economic interests when unions and workers went on strike. One of the main tools that workers had in their toolbox was to strike. And if an entire block of that, like because of vertical and horizontal integration, if all of your employees went on strike, you had a crisis in the country because suddenly the trains weren't operating. If the trains weren't operating, people couldn't get places, business couldn't happen. It's kind of what's happening now. Products couldn't get to where they're going. Farmers couldn't send their products. Their food would fail. And so in cases like that where it was a national emergency, there were times when the president would actually would step in and say, because of national security, national concern, economic policy, we're gonna force you to go back or you're gonna lose your job. And I'm trying to think, the Pullman strike in 1894 was a railroad car strike. President Cleveland did order strikers to go back to work or lose their jobs. Supreme Court ruled in favor of him. In that particular strike, Eugene V. Debs, who we'll see later on, he kind of becomes a commie, sort of. He was the president of the American Railway Union, and he was actually arrested and put in jail for a couple of years. I think he ran for president from jail. And then the other one is Coxey's Army. Jacob Coxey or Coxey was a businessman in Ohio, and he and hundreds of others of his fellow union men were fired, and so they lost their jobs, and they marched to Washington, D.C. and demanded that, well, if government is going to support the employers, you need to support the employees with unemployment benefits, which didn't exist at that time. And the president called in federal troops and ran them out of town. So over the course of time, as we march closer and closer to 1900, and like with the Haymarket strikes and affairs, unions are going to become associated with civil unrest, and Americans become very nervous about it. And so they lose their popularity and they lose their influence. They come back later, but they do die away. They lose their power as the century turns to the 21st century. Oh, let's see here. Okay, the presidential campaign of 1896 was kind of a political turning point. It moves political power away from the Democrats as a whole to the Republican Party, and I think it's like the next 15 presidents, minus a couple of them, are Republicans, and the Republicans control most of the House and Senate during that era as well. And this is a presidential campaign that pits William Jennings Bryan as the Democratic candidate against Republican William McKinley. And it is during this presidential campaign that William Jennings Bryan gives one of his very famous speeches called Cross of Gold, where he makes the case for a silver-based monetary system. And essentially, that's kind of his main platform when he runs for president. This is when the Democrats come together with a populist, and they hope they have enough to throw out the Republicans. Actually, they're not successful. But as far as the third party goes, the populists had gained huge momentum, only to lose that power as Republicans become entrenched. And so because of the economic downturn at the end of the century, Republicans' promise of a tariff to protect workers tended to garner them support amongst the workers that worked in the large cities that had high populations and lots of electoral votes. And so the Republicans end up taking that election. William McKinley wins the election. William McKinley is unfortunately going to be the next president that is assassinated at the beginning of his second term. And he picks a spunky New Yorker named Theodore Roosevelt to be his vice president in his second term, which sets Teddy up for the ride of our lives, because Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, and the rest is history. So, real interesting side note, you probably caught this in your reading, but William McKinley is believed to be the inspiration for the Wizard and the Wizard of Oz, and a lot of the symbolism in the movie Wizard of Oz, which came out a few years after that. The Yellow Brick Road is believed to be the Republican platform of gold-based monetary system. Green has to do with the greenback money. Apparently Dorothy wore silver slippers in the book, which represented William Jennings Bryan's silver platform. And if you see the picture of William McKinley and you see the movie, the original one, he looks a lot, the character they picked to play the wizard looks a lot like William McKinley. So I don't know if it's true, but I've read that several different places. So, okay, and then moving on really quickly. Before I move on, there is a video clip that I want you to watch, and there's a film strip on my PowerPoint next to Mr. McKinley, President McKinley, that says, watch Hip Hugh's video of the election of 1896. It's very, very good, and this truly could be a theme for a DBQ because it's such a significant election. It's sort of like the significance of Abraham Lincoln's election before the Civil War. This is a huge election, changing political landscape that's going to move into the progressive era, and a whole bunch of reform movements like women getting the right to vote, prohibition, direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, just a whole host of things are going to change, which were very different than our founding, and it pivots on this election. So definitely watch this video. It's 11 minutes long. He's a professor, and he does, or a teacher, I think he teaches lots of AP classes, but he does videos on all kinds of subjects. I haven't watched this one all the way through. I kind of flipped through it a little bit. Sometimes he can be a little off color. He's a little bit corny. He's not quite as corny as John Green, but his information is really, really good. And so I definitely want you to watch that. So when you get to that point in the PowerPoint, watch that video before you move on to the next thing. So the next section is about how the South kind of goes really south. As far as segregation and their relationship with their black citizens. And so real quick, I'm going to zip through this really quick. I'm looking at my timer on my phone. It looks like I am already almost at 30 minutes. So I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly. Segregated South. Okay, so there was a movement after Reconstruction called the Redeemer Movement, and it was an attempt by Southerners to redeem what Reconstruction had done to the South and to bring back the old way of doing things. During Reconstruction, radical Republicans and others had pushed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They had occupied the South with troops. Many blacks had served in public offices. Many blacks had registered to vote. In fact, they had voted for Republicans. And the Redeemers wanted to redeem the old Southern way of doing things where white people were firm in the saddle and black people were subjugated to them. And so they set out to do that. One of the things that the book talks about, and there was a question about this, was this convict labor system, which I personally find horrible. I'm trying to think of the right word. To think that black Americans could be arrested for stealing a chicken, put in a prison, and then used to do free labor for maybe some of the same people they had worked for before as slaves is just sickening. However, that happens, sounds like, very regularly in the South. And it even says that the railroads and mining companies also would use this convict labor. Um, the South continued to refuse to industrialize. I don't know why. They had kind of these dreams of days gone by, and the cotton market just stunk. The corn wheat market was still struggling, and so their refusal to mechanize and industrialize some of their areas, like large cities, or they didn't have a whole lot of large cities, but areas that could have developed into large industrial cities, is just, I don't know why. I think the book says that even Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940s said that the economic black hole of America was still the South, as recently as World War II. I know that when you look at the literacy rates and test scores of southern states versus the rest of the country, even to this day, the South is still lagging way behind. One of the things the book talks about is the fact that the southern states refused to invest in education. I guess they thought that the families would continue to, I'll call it homeschooling. Of course, black children were really left in the dust, and so illiteracy, lack of education was a terrible problem in the South and continued to be all the way until World War II. Many blacks decided to leave the South. I think the book says between 40 and 60,000 black Americans left the South and went to Kansas. They are called exodusters. If you see that word, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to black Americans that left the South to look for new opportunities in the state of Kansas. So exodusters in Kansas, and that took place 1879, 1880-ish. And then ultimately, what has been successful for eliminating and removing Republicans out of the South was to prevent blacks from voting. And so in the years during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, a significant number of blacks, especially in the cities in the South, continued to vote and continued to register to vote. And not as obviously as significantly as they did when there were troops in the South protecting their rights, but they did continue to vote. But between 1890 and 1906, a number of things were passed that prevented blacks from voting. Now, the 15th Amendment, which is the Black Voting Rights Amendment, which said that you could not discriminate based upon the color of somebody's skin or their former condition of servitude in allowing them to vote. They had the right to vote, and that could not be prohibited by the states. The states found ways around that, and I've listed 3 of them here: the poll tax, the literacy tests, and then something called the grandfather clause. And so the poll tax, because it did not specifically cite the color of skin, it applied to everybody, had to pay the poll tax, but of course the poorest among them couldn't afford the tax, and so they couldn't vote. And that also influenced poor whites as well, which the ruling class didn't really mind if the poor whites weren't voting. And so it didn't discriminate based on color, it discriminated based upon really economic situation. Of course, literacy tests also. You had to be able to read a basic a basic bit of English in order to vote, and if you couldn't, then you couldn't vote. And again, that disproportionately affected poor white and poor blacks, and the goal was the poor blacks and the poor whites got wrapped up into it, or swept up into it as well. The grandfather clause was introduced in some states, which said that these laws didn't apply to you if your grandfather could vote before 1865 or whatever. And so all whites whose grandparents were registered to vote prior to that, even if they couldn't read, and even if sometimes they couldn't pay a tax, I think, they could vote. And so it definitely discriminated against blacks, and that was pretty much ruled in the courts to be unconstitutional. The book says that this is a staggering number to me, by 1940, only 3%, 3% of adult black Southerners were registered to vote. That is just staggering. So obviously, this Redeemer movement and this desire to eliminate black vote was successful. Thank you, Democrat Party. Okay. And then the next slide talks about Plessy versus Ferguson and the situation of Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was a very fair-skinned black American, and there's a picture of him in here. He doesn't really look like a black man. his organization that he volunteered with wanted to find a good case to take before the Supreme Court to challenge segregation laws in the South that segregated places, public places, like publicly ran um, bus stations, train facilities, those sorts of things, and the Homer Plessy, one of the places that was segregated in Plessy's hometown, which I think was Tennessee. I meant to look this up. Louisiana, sorry. Um, the railroads were segregated. There were black cars and white cars, and Homer Plessy decided he was just going to challenge the segregation situation, and he presented his ID, which identified him as a colored man. And they told him he had to go back to the other car, and he refused to, so he was arrested. And then he filed suit against them for a violation of his constitutional rights. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that as long as facilities were equal in availability, equal in accommodations, were they comfortable, were there bathrooms available, those sorts of things, to the white cars, then it was fine. And this became known as the separate but equal doctrine. And once that passed, it was in 1896, once the Supreme Court ruled that, Southern states just went crazy and began to introduce that in private facilities as well as public facilities. So you have your black and white movie theaters, black and white restrooms, black and white water fountains, black and white sidewalks, all kinds of things. And so the Supreme Court paved the way for that. And that became the law of the land from 1896 until the late 1950s, I believe, is when Brown versus Board of Education overturns that ruling. So just a crazy ruling, probably up there with Dred Scott, one of the worst rulings ever in the Supreme Court history. So, and so what Homer Plessy hoped would be a vindication of the fact that their rights were being violated ended up being a reinforcement that the South was doing everything the way they should, which was just a tragedy. Following that, you have just an incredible, actually not following that, in addition to that, the legal authorities of the South, the communities of the South, society as a whole, decided that they were vigilantes, that they could protect and serve and be the law unto themselves related to their black communities. And so lynchings, public and private lynchings, skyrocketed. The book says that between 1883 and 1905, that every single Southern state had lynched at least 50 people every year during that time frame. And from 1880 to 1940, a 60-year period, over 5,000 people in the United States, primarily in the South, 99% of them black, were lynched. There were cases where white civil rights activists were helping black Americans in some capacity, and they found themselves murdered. Ida Wells is a very famous author. She was the leading anti-lynching crusader. She used the bully pulpit of her pen. She was an author, and she worked for a newspaper. There's a picture of her there. I decided not to put a bunch of pictures of lynchings in there because it's just disturbing. There is one, probably from the 1930s or 20s. And there's a chart here, this is from your book, it says states with over 200 lynchings between 1889 and 1918. Arkansas is listed. Between 1889 and 1918, the people of Arkansas lynched over 214 people. And then there is a very short video clip. It's only about 4.5 minutes long, that starts out talking briefly about Plessy versus Ferguson case and how that leads directly into Jim Crow. And they will show you images and pictures all the way into the 1920s and 1930s. It's definitely something I want you to watch and worth seeing. And then finally, almost done here. Finally, this section ends with a discussion about something called the lost cause mythology. After segregation became institutionalized in the South, blacks were being prevented from voting. The Democrat Party had nestled everybody in, and they were, living the Southern life again. There was kind of a rewriting of history, a glamorizing or romanticizing of what the Civil War was, and that it was, the book describes it, just a feud between brothers. Really had nothing to do with slavery. And you, to this very day, you still have Southerners, especially older Southerners, say, "Oh, the Civil War was about states' rights. It wasn't about slavery." They refuse to acknowledge that. And somehow acknowledging that slavery was a pretty significant part of why the war took place is admitting some sort of guilt. And so at the turn of the century, this lost cause mythology, stories about like the Robert E. Lees and the Stonewall Jacksons being these wonderful Southern gentlemen, not the picture of the horrors of slavery, but of Southern gentlemen, and the way of wonderful plantation living, that antebellum period. And they began to erect all kinds of Confederate statues all over the country. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the Confederacy would raise funds. Different organizations would raise funds, and they would put these statues of Confederate soldiers to glamorize and to remember an era and the way they wanted to remember it, not the way that actually happened. And so we have that in our own Bentonville Square. That statue was put up in 1908, and I believe he was a governor of Arkansas and who had served as a Confederate general or Confederate soldier. Last year when I was teaching this, I happened to be in Texas, and right there in the front of the Texas State Capitol, in Austin, are all of these Civil War statues, and I showed you a picture of it in your PowerPoint. In your book, it says, "Slavery, Inc." This is related to the lost cause mythology. On page 652, this is a quote from your book. "Slavery increasingly came to be viewed as a minor issue, not the war's fundamental cause. Southern governments erected monuments to the lost cause, a romanticized version of slavery, the Old South, and the Confederate experience." And so it has all of these pictures or these statues of Confederate soldiers. And I looked at the date on this particular monument, and it was erected in 1901. And it says, it's kind of funny, it says, "These men died for states' rights guaranteed under the Constitution." And it goes on to explain why they fought in the Civil War. It wasn't about slavery; it was about states' rights. And so that is the romanticized version that was retold over the next 100 years. And in a lot of ways, the movie that we watched, just a couple of clips over Gods and Generals, displays that sort of romanticized version of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I think those were nice men. I'm not saying that they weren't. But that is the image that Southerners preferred to portray about the Civil War rather than the institution of slavery and all of that. So, okay, so that brings this to a conclusion. The last PowerPoint says what's due for Wednesday. And so I want you to read parts of the rest of the chapter. There's parts of it I don't want you to read. I'm just going to summarize it in my next lesson. And then, make sure you read that. And then your period 6 questions, numbers 18 through 22, are from the section that you just read. And then the last 3 questions, 23, 24, and 25, are from the section that you're going to read for Wednesday. The period questions are not due until we take our quiz. We're probably going to take our quiz at the beginning of class next Monday over chapter. Actually, I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, so stay tuned on that. Let's just plan on taking the quiz next Monday, so a week from today. And but I just wanted you to know what period question, where those questions were. There's one question, I think it's number 17, that I'm going to skip because I think it's covered in what I'm going to be teaching you on Wednesday rather than what you're going to read. So for Wednesday, read those pages. There'll be some writing assignments on Wednesday. And then there are a couple of other things that I want you to do for Wednesday that will be in the instructions in Google Classroom. So just read that. Make sure that you know what's due for Wednesday. So I think that's it. Have a great night. I will see you I keep saying I'll see you tomorrow, but I'll see you later. Bye.